So this week we convened over Hegel, and it's unfortunately just Daniel and I. And when it's just Daniel and I, it tends to be we tend to have the whole discussion before the recording. So we never actually get to recording what was meant to be recorded. But in any case, this isn't going to be some weird art piece like the last time, although I suspect it will be weird. So in the past few episodes, we've been talking about the question of knowing being and can being be knowable. But we want to interrupt our regular broadcasting this week and sort of take a pause and take a step back and reflect on why we should bother to read the phenomenology of spirit at all, or like why read Hegel. Um, and we've decided that the best way to do it would be through personal anecdote, because I'm an individual, and since I have a sort of individuality to me, there's a sort of universality contained in that. And you are an individual too. And so you'll have your own personal experience. And perhaps in being the type of thing that can have personal experiences, you'll be able to relate to my personal experience. Okay. So why do I read Hegel? Why have I started reading Hegel? Well, it started because I was interested in reading Kant, and we had a few lectures on Kant, and I ended up reading the Critique of Pure Reason at some point, and there were all of these like I want to say crazy ideas, but also normal ideas. Like there was this idea of sort of the world as a construction, like that very much like the common first year philosophy class, the matrix objection to everything. What if it's all a construction, man? Sort of going on in Kant. Like one of the things, and this is a terrible reading of Kant, so don't take it seriously and don't attribute it to me because that'll be problematic. One of the things about reading Kant is that like he comes to say that what we experience in our ordinary life, the objects that we interact with, salt, pepper, chairs, dogs, the whole realm of being that we interact with, are not things in themselves divorced from us. They're not things that exist by themselves, but they're appearances and are somehow dependent on our mind. In fact, his whole major problem is called the problem of synthesis a priori, and that's just a fancy term for a problem of how we can construct things through pure reason. Synthesizing is a sort of construction, and a priori is just what we do independent of experience. And so it's how we can put together our experience through the mind and how our mind can make a genuine contribution to knowledge. And so when I was exploring his work, there were all these themes and motifs that popped up. That was one of them. The other one that was really big for me was that objectification talk. Um, I don't really tend to dabble in ethics, but maybe one day I will. But people always talk about like you're objectifying women or like you're objectifying this person. And like that objectification talk means that you're like treating that person as if though they were an object. And so like one of the ways in which we can treat a person as an object is to say that they're predictable. Like if Dan's predictable, like say I've characterized Dan, and like for me, Dan is like this hippie, like like he is all into yoga and like meditation and mindfulness and stuff like that. And like that's all I ever expect from Dan. I don't expect Dan to like say anything beyond like I don't know, like some like ancient Indian wisdom. But eventually Dan says something that like throws me completely for a loop. And like I stop objectifying him for a moment. Like, I don't know. He there's moments, and it's happened before. I can't think of one now, but he stops having that sort of like hippie outlook. Like when we are doing that series on Plato, he wants to make like a serious difference in society, and he like wants to have like practical approaches, and keeps like reiterating that we need to make these videos practical and approachable and accessible to people because that's the only way we're gonna affect change. And so for some reason in my head, that affecting change is in conflict with the hippiness. Um, and so they shouldn't be able to coexist. But why they do, at least from a Kantian perspective, is because Dan's not an object. He's a person. And what it means to not be an object is to be unpredictable. It's to sort of, have this unpredictable nature to you. Like, you're not an object. And when I objectify you, I'm treating you as something that you're not. And I should not treat you that way, firstly, because it's bad, but it's bad because it misidentifies your very nature. Like, the error is one not only of ethical proportions, but also like epistemological dimensions. It would be as bad to call a fork a spoon as to objectify a person. Like, what you're doing is you're making them into an object when they should be a subject. And so that was where I got into it for Kant. Um, and that was why I really started reading Kant. And I think that Kant has a very pervasive effect on how we understand thinking today, whether we implicitly or explicitly, so whether we are aware of it or not. I think that we still use many of his concepts and presuppose many of his ideas, usually in a somewhat mangled, distorted way, or like in an unpure way, than how it appears in his original philosophy. That's not to say that the unpure way is bad. It's just to say that the way it is currently is unpure, and that is a result of some form of development. The reason to read Hegel, then, I think, is because Hegel exists in a post Kantian world. Um, so Hegel has a sort of his actual existence, like historically. He comes to find himself in this world which is much more conceptually defined by Kant. Like, people are really starting to think about these things and acting out in ways that are like defined by Kant's three critiques. But he also comes to see that there's a problem in Kant's three critiques, and like a fairly big one. And the problem is the one that we've been focusing on, the unity of knowing and being, the unity of knower and known. And so that problem that I've been trying to explain and that I've been trying to focus on is what happens when we get a sort of Kantian picture, which is a picture that tries to do epistemology without doing ontology. It tries to focus on our knowledge and the structure of our knowing instead of the thing that we know and what it is like by itself. We get a sort of knower and a thing in itself, and the thing in itself remains unknown to the knower on the Kantian account. Hegel sort of sees that and realizes that like raises a big problem. Like, we get the various formulations of the problem of knowing being that I've formed over the past few weeks, but we sort of get a knower that has no existence because they are divorced from being. They are not. And we get a being which is, but which we can never know to be. Um, so we get this thing that exists that's doing this activity of knowing, but we're not claiming that it exists because we're not making any claims about its being. And we get a being that exists, which we can't make any claims about its existence, and so we can't even say that it exists. We get these two sort of separate things that aren't really what they should be. And so I think that's the main point that Hegel's trying to make, is that we can't do these subjects separately. Like, epistemology and ontology, or thinking about knowing and thinking about being, or doing philosophy, is not an activity that happens successively. We don't think about being first and then think about knowing. We sort of have to do it at the same time. It's a simultaneous approach to knowing and being. And it must be a simultaneous approach because what we see if we don't take the simultaneous approach is that being and knowing run into their own problems. And so what we get is the fancy phrase that I was using earlier is we get an ontology of epistemology and an epistemology of ontology. Or we get a being that knows and a being that is knowable. And so I think that's really the benefit of reading Hegel, is freeing ourselves, or if it's something worth freeing ourselves, at least opening up to ourselves to the possibility that being is not inaccessible, that there is something out there to be known, that the world is not just a construction. Um, all of those big skeptical things that we tend to sort of dandy about sort of carelessly nowadays, are sort of commonsensical. Uh, and it's tough. It's difficult work. Like the phenomenology, I've been saying it for the past few weeks, is it's been a nightmare to like to trudge through. But part of the nightmare is that I've been under false impressions, or that I have impressions that are very difficult to free myself from. Partially because they're natural, as Hegel asserts. It's like part of the way that we're built, that we come to have these assumptions. And also because historically there's a lot of them that pop up. We are fed this information on a day-to-day basis. People speak in this language of subjectivity and objectivity, or reality and our minds, and how we represent things and how things are in themselves. And this language is so common that like it just gets shoved down our throats, and we're taught to accept that from a very young age. And so when we start reading Hegel, part of the big difficulty is that we have to let go of those, the familiar terms that we're used to. We have to invent a new vocabulary or learn a new vocabulary. And for some of us that are older than others, showing my age here, that's difficult because it means letting go of a world which we're comfortable in. To come to see the world as not a construction, to come to open ourselves to the possibility of knowing being, to let go of reality as an appearance, is to construct the world anew for oneself. It's to be open to a whole new world. And a whole new world is scary. No one knows what's in it. No one knows what it is yet. And just the falling away of the previous world is terrifying too. Like all your concepts shatter, and the things that you thought were appearances turn out not to be. Um, being turns out not to be. There's all these weird and difficult passages in Hegel where it seems as though like everything is falling apart. But that falling apart is natural, and it's something not to be run away from. It's something to approach with courage. And the reason why I suggest we approach it with courage, at least while we're starting to read Hegel, is so we can see this new world and perhaps live in it for a little bit. We can sort of be the type of things in a world without the separation. Try that sort of world out for ourselves and see whether it's worth living in, see whether if it's true, I guess. Um, and so that's my project with the phenomenology of spirit, in a very personal sharing way, is to open myself up to the possibility of a world where we can know things, where being isn't alien to knowing, where I am not alien to the world around me and the world around me is not alien to me, where I find myself to be both in the world and one with the world in a very deep, meaningful way. Um, but yeah, opening yourself up to that is difficult. And I hope to succeed in that quest through that question and the central framing of the problem of being and knowing.
Rad. That's probably that's probably good to close there. So this has been public relations for philosophy, and the fourth of our being knowable. And um, that was good for me to hear, Hadley. The even just that different register of giving like the personal relation and personal history, like why it was that Kant uh took a grip for you, and then you ended up doing your master's on or over that material. And I mean, the reason why we clicked record now was out of that um, reflection and insight that is kind of well known by us now, that studying philosophy and studying these philosophers is um, deeply personal, in surprising ways in that we come to inherit our very way of being and thinking from thinkers. And that's the history of philosophy. And the degree to which that is true, the degree to which the very way that we think about our world is in some way the inheritance or consequence of others who have thought about the world and constructed something. However, you think about that in terms of being like this immense creative thing or intuiting and mapping structures that are developing in time and then um, put it the various ways to think about it. The fact is that we are here as kind of contingent, almost said necessities, but we come to be the way that we are because of our inheritance and the study of philosophy, the doing philosophy, um, is very much coming to terms with that inheritance. So there's an excavation. It's like an archaeology, and that begins to break into um, create creativity, into creative capacity or potentials. So there's a strong and many whys for why one should grapple with such texts and such thinkers, and it can be uniquely frustrating. Luckily for me, I that doesn't that turns into humor pretty quickly. That I can get so frustrated by what some guy wrote some while ago, and that sense it gives me a bit of a steam. Um, then I think the last thing, just like a reflective, how peculiar the text is. Hadley has been suggesting that, um, and the insight came from him in reading the critique of pure reason, and trying to write about it in an academic context, and basically thinking and saying that to do it is to read it, or to read the thing. Simply, you need to read it. There's only so much you can say around and about, and that's been a kind of something we've reflected on in terms of coming to record because we're experimenting with this recording and with this format, this medium, this way of being over the text. Um, but there's something to the very process of reading the text. So as I was trying to get through perception, which did a whole bunch of inversions that I just couldn't keep straight, and that's probably a feature, not a bug. I was then brought into a state of near frustration, but it meant that I read through Force and Understanding with force. So that's just a kind of self-reflective reflection on the text and the kind of living material that um, that it might be. Again, this is a philosophy of public relations, maybe going advertisement that I think is maybe resonating with two or three people in our circles at, at the moment, Hadley, but I think we are doing good work, benefiting greatly. I'm very grateful for walking through this text with you. It seems like today we're just breaking into something like self-consciousness, recognizing the self that is in things, that self that is gestured by the it self. And that's exciting territory. That's that's me. Oh, the I think the in terms of your objectification of me as this yogi loving that vibe. There's a peculiar thing that there's some kind of dialectic between us, even the way that we approaching this text and balancing in the kind of attitudes of approach. Um, but like you poured into Kant and I was like, okay, what about the Bhagavad Gita uh, and I guess it's just our skin tone that would be the difference, cultural inheritance. But I wanted the um that antithesis of the mindfulness image. Um, nah, let me leave it there. Yeah.
No, I think there's something to be said. I think before we pause recording,
Yes. Yes.
I think firstly, C4 brought it up like the other week when we were doing the Platonic texts. I think I was trying to talk about like Indian philosophy at some point, and I'm obviously Indian, and like my knowledge of Indian philosophy is incredibly limited. Like I haven't read like the Bhagavad Gita, I haven't read any of the texts, and I don't really care to. But like I live around people who like are religious and like believe in Hinduism and like have these sorts of interactions and sort of interact with the world in this very Hindu way. On the contrary, like Dan reads these texts and involves himself in like yoga and meditation and all of these sort of like spiritualistic practices from the religion. And so like in one sense, like I've got the sort of immediacy of being with me. Like I am, but I don't really understand it. And on the other sense, like Dan has like the understanding, but like, is it a lived understanding as yet? So he's got like the concept, but the concept hasn't realized that it is. And so like the what both of us are sort of missing, or sort of how we complement each other in that weird way, is that like we should both like we both sort of lack what the other has, and like are in a position to complete ourselves in that way, but like have not, I guess, so to speak. And then you were talking about just before that as well, the sort of the antithesis of the yogi. I don't know what that would be. Like someone who's boisterous and makes claims about everything, I think would be like what I would imagine. But like, I also am aware that you are like a sporting jock as like a sort of younger teenager or something. Like you must have had like your jock years in high school, and that like arrogance or like that like brashness jocks have is like in like vast contradiction to like who you've become, I think. But I'm okay with it because I know that you're a person and you're allowed to change. That's the unpredictability of it all. It's like I tried to pick a characteristic that's present now so that everybody else could see it, but I'm aware that there must have been various other characters that have been done in their lives.
Yeah, I was I was thinking specifically there of having come to recover Christian faith and coming to confess Christ as like it's a and the way that because this text has actually been a big part of that. Um, and and that recovery has also um, there's like a bunch of reevaluation of material. So it's a returning to uh, this tradition, if we speak about it in those general terms. So that like the antithesis of that image in that, but then the nature of recovery as being um, like a productive or a, a creation of sorts. It's not just a return. We kind of we gesture towards the stuff in the decolonial context and thinking decolonization from a space of the dialectic that seems to be going on in the phenomenology of spirit. Um, whose spirit Zizek might be kind of best exhibiting or using in his thought. And Zizek often points back to, or is pointing back explicitly to Hegel and saying that we must return and think him. Um, and then it is also getting a sense of the importance of Zizek's thinking today and knowing that must return to Hegel in order to get a sense of what Zizek is happening. So it's a sense of like um, philosophical material often insists in this manner, like it insists to be dealt with, to be worked through, and it keeps insisting. Uh, until one works through it in some way. Um, a jock, yeah, yeah, it's probably fair. But I'll okay, maybe it's like a revelation.
I
You
think
see
that's it.
that
Mm. A half half.
matching hairstyles almost.
Sick.
Yeah, so no, I'm also artsy, you know. I'm artsy and different and stuff.
Yeah,
Self-differentiating.
exactly. And in being self-differentiating, you're exactly the same as me.
Oh no, that's not where we want to end up.
Mm.
So we're probably going to do the loop or the inversion of each other coming into next week. Um, what are we going
Yeah,
to aim at?
I think we'll aim at what we always aim at. So next week, well, actually, I haven't told them this, but it'll be, well, everybody's done. Next week will be sort of the last week before I head off to go do my PhD in the States. And so I think next week would be a good one to end on, even if it's just for a moment. And it's just for having a break from the text and carrying on with regular life or picking up another text and seeing how we go. But I think we should aim for the beginning of self consciousness or the first section of self consciousness. And I think we should aim for that because self consciousness is really for the first time, I think, where object and subject, or knower and known, or knowing and being come into contact with another. And they do so by coming to the revelation that knowing is a being or has a being. It is, it exists. And the being that knowing knows is in its own way a reflection of itself or itself. Consciousness knows itself and so it becomes self conscious. It is an object to itself, it is the being known, and it is the knower. And so, in that sense, self consciousness will be our first exhibition of a picture where knowing and being come into contact and come into unity with one another, where we can really see what a Hegelian world will start to look like.
Yeah, it feels like at least in the conversation that we had prior, that's kind of this is the beginning of that movement beyond the Kantian, um, where Kant stops, or where what we inherit from him can be developed. Yeah, that's exciting. So Sipo and Avile, please meet us there.